Some games you never forget, and for me one of those is the 1996 mech simulation by Sierra, Earthsiege 2. And you're immediately reminded of the era in which this was released, just after starting a new game, choosing a difficulty and name for yourself by your lovely, overacting, digitized commanding officer here.
Welcome back to the fight, soldier. I hope you enjoyed your leave. We don't have much time, so I'll get straight to the point. The Cybrids are back in a big way. Assault transports have touched down in Alpha, Delta, and Echo sectors. There's no longer any doubt. Prometheus has reestablished control over the entire Cybrid command network. The moon is the jump-off point for the Cybrid invasion. Our spy sats imaged a massive base complex on the dark side before they got blasted. Intelligence confirms that Prometheus is operating from this compound. We're working on a plan to deal with the base, but right now our top priority is defending Earth. I'm posting you to Alpha Sector, where we're about to begin trials of our new air skimmer prototype. You'll be one of the test pilots. If the Razor checks out, we can begin full production. Good luck, soldier. I know you won't let me down. Gearling out.
And then, after preparation, you can start up the mission and hear those wonderful, familiar words.
Power up initiated. All systems nominal.
And this will be your first mission, your first foray into the rust-ridden world that is the planet after what's happened in Earthsiege 2. And it's really quite the thing. So I mentioned it is in fact a mech simulation game, and that's exactly what it is. And we'll talk more about the simulation elements a little bit later that go more into the logistics of actually running a team, which is pretty neat for the time. But what you're going to be seeing here is your first basic combat mission. That's exactly what it is. It's just basic combat. But there's some cool elements. You can do things like twist the top part of your mech, or Herc as it's called, short for a Herculan, which is of course a overly long 90s acronym. You can twist the turret, the top part of it, separate from your legs, which gets a little bit confusing after a little while, which is what that indicator above the compass is for. You can link different weapon groups together and select different ones in volleys that you may or may not want to fire. You can push the energy of your shields, which is that indicator in the bottom right of the screen, forward and backward, to where you have more protection in the front or back for your shields. And you can even do things like changing radar modes to active or passive, which determine the distance and accuracy with which you will detect your enemies, and how will they detect you, of course, because in an active mode they can see you from farther away just as you can see them. And in passive mode, you basically have to have line of sight to them in order to detect them on radar as well. So it's really quite a lot of mechanics to get used to, which is why the first few missions are a little slower paced to help you get the hang of things. And this is really meant to be played with a joystick, but I don't have an older, more compatible joystick for this like I used to when I was a kid. So I'm actually playing it with the keyboard, and I have to admit the keyboard controls are a little wonky. You're using like two clusters, the cursor keys and I, J, K, and M, as well as some odd keys that are almost never used anymore, like backspace and backslash, and it's very strange. But it works. It just takes a little getting used to. And there, you can also see that you have some elements of structural weapon and internal damage modeling for yourself and the enemies. You can see that on the enemies as well, and it's actually fairly impressive. You can go into this detail as detailed as the like servos of your legs, and even individual weapons can get blown off of the outside of your Herc and things like that, which is really neat. And is also partially integral to how you engage your enemies, because there's a salvage system in the game. Ideally, the way I, for instance, destroyed that enemy right there isn't perfect, because what you actually want to do is take out their legs. If you cripple them, take out their legs, preferably one leg, you get a lot more salvage at the end of a mission. And if you leave their weapons intact, you can actually take their weapons from them. However, as you can see in instances like this, that's not always an option. When things get really messy, and it's actually a pretty impressive piece of the engine, you can see in big skirmishes like this with multiple friendlies and multiple enemies, you can see just bits of metal and stuff just flying off of enemies and lasers firing in the distance and fires being started. It's really pretty awesome. I always thought it was a really immersive part of the game as a kid because I hadn't really experienced an actual simulation like this before, aside from early versions of Microsoft Flight Sim. And I wasn't really familiar with the idea of non-realistic vehicle sims, if you get what I mean. The idea that you could simulate something that doesn't exist, like a giant mech. So I had never played MechWarrior or the first Earthsiege before, so this was very new to me. And as it turns out, it was very much worth checking out. And in instances like this, there's often so much going on that the precision targeting of enemies can get very challenging. However, trying to get all of this salvage and trying not to horrifically destroy all of your enemy's weapons as often as you can is actually a very valuable thing to do because it allows you to build more perks for yourself and your crew to take them on further missions. As you can see here, other Hercs that you can pilot will have different cockpits. All of them look different on the inside, which is a very cool little feature. Even little details like the position of the throttle, the radar screens or information screens, the energy indicators and weapon readouts, the shield indicator and its shape even differs. It's all really kind of neatly detailed and differs between every drivable or pilotable Herc. You also have the issue of actually arming them, and there are quite a large variety of different weapons, and as I mentioned, you can take your enemy's weapons if you refrain from blowing them up, but you can also build your own. Building weapons takes salvage, and it takes time. Basically, the only way to advance time in this game is to go on a mission, and that can be a problem for you if you need, say, a medium Herc for a mission because you feel that you are too outgunned to survive in a light one, but you don't have a medium Herc currently because it will take several missions worth of time to build, which means you just gotta deal with what you have. Basically, you have to keep yourself repaired, armed, and ready for tougher missions, because the missions will get tougher, and you've got to get stronger with them, but the game will not do that for you. You've got to do it yourself. And that's where the simulation aspect really comes into its own in Earthsiege 2. Now, as far as the logistics side of the simulation goes, you'll be able to do things like build different Hercs from a list of available ones that will expand as you complete missions to get new prototypes, as long as you have the available tonnage for it, and an available spot in your hangar. Each one will take a different number of sorts of space and time to complete, depending on the size. And you can also, of course, arm each hardpoint with different weapons that you, well, whichever ones you see fit, I suppose, and whichever ones will actually fit in that space. Your crew will start out as a bunch of rookies, like yourself, and you can put them all in their own individual Hercs that will be, you know, kind of poorly armed, and they will all be very low rank. However, as they survive various battles and you get more and more good equipment and Hercs, you can specialize them and put them in larger Hercs, and they will be more able to use better gear more effectively and target more efficiently and become elite soldiers like yourself. Now, another pretty interesting and often unexpected aspect of the game is that it isn't actually just mechs that you simulate. There's a little bit of flight sim in here as well. Occasionally you will be tasked to fly the Razor, which is an aircraft. And the Razor is customizable in the same way as a Herc is, so you can load up its hardpoints with whatever will fit and whatever you think will be hilarious, and you can really just customize it for whatever task you were set out to do. You know, strap on a bunch of plasma cannons for ground attack, or that'd be a really bad idea, don't do that. Or use a lot of autocannons and lasers for longer range combat, or, you know, whatever you are tasked to do for the mission. missiles are a good choice, and actually go flying. And it does have a pretty good flight model for a game of this time, especially considering that the game isn't focused on flight. So it was a surprise for a lot of people to see this and see it done so well. The controls do take a significant amount of getting used to, as you can probably tell, especially without a joystick. With a joystick, it works just fine. It's a pretty cool looking little aircraft as well. However, when you get used to it, it's actually a lot of fun to fly. It has full pitch, roll, throttle, yaw, and everything control. And that little green and red indicator to the right of the crosshair and my mouse in the way, annoyingly, is actually a sort of hybrid altimeter kind of idea, where the red is an indicator of the ground's proximity to your belly, so don't let the red and the green circle, which is the indicator of your height, touch, because then the mission is over. And things start to get pretty complicated when you can actually take this into missions, because the game in a lot of missions doesn't actually limit you to only taking Hercs or only taking the Razor. You can actually choose one or the other sometimes, and actually, you know, put yourself in the crew screen into either a Herc of your choice or the Razor. So there are some missions where you can do a ground attack or an air attack, which is a really cool bit of choice and something that a lot of games from this era don't necessarily do. And that's going to bring me on to the mission design, which is one of the absolute prime elements of this game, and something that blew my mind as a kid, because I'd never played a game that actually did what this game does with its mission structure before. I'd played this. And to be honest with you, I think it's something, personally, that a lot of modern games could actually learn from, and this was in 1996. The game sort of toys with failure states a little bit, in that when you lose a mission, when you fail, you don't actually lose the game most of the time. You can continue on. And you don't necessarily... I suppose the best way to put it is, you don't necessarily always get a game over and have to reload just because you got blown up. Which was very interesting. I should also point out, before we move on, that the Razor missions are the first time you encounter these. These are pit bulls. Pit bulls do not like you. They are basically giant walking fortresses. And like I said, the Razor missions are the first times you actually will see these. And they're one of the earlier large threats that you'll encounter. Kind of fascinating to see because they're just so huge and different from what you normally encounter. And they're also one of the only enemy types that actually use weapons that you can't, which is kind of a big deal. Every other enemy Herc uses weapons that you use. However, these things, as you can probably tell, have some sort of giant tri-linked EMP cannon on top of them most of the time, as well as like various missiles and cannons and things alongside them. And you can't have those. You don't have access to any of that stuff. And those EMPs on top of them will just obliterate your shields in like a few volleys, especially if you're in the Razor, because it's very fragile. And these are some of the only enemies that the plasma cannon, which I'll feature a little bit later, isn't just like massive overkill on. But they are very fun to take down, and as you could probably imagine, if you're able to take out their legs or something like that, which is pretty difficult because they're very well armored, they are worth a huge amount of salvage at the end of a mission, if you're actually alive to collect it by then. But going back to the mission structure of the game, let's give an example, for instance. Let's say you are tasked to destroy 3 enemy bases in a region. And you could, for instance, succeed in the mission by touching down and destroying the 3 enemy bases and extracting. That would be a mission success, and you would move on to a mission after that. You could also touch down and just get the crap blown out of you before you even get to the first base, and have a horrible failure. You wouldn't actually lose the game. At that point, you would move on to another mission, but it would be a different mission from the one that you would move on to if you would have succeeded. Which was interesting to me as a kid, because I'd never seen a game that did that before. Usually if you died, you lost. That was it. But that's not the case here. You take pretty huge hits to what you can do, because of course the repair costs and building new Hercs and losing crew and stuff like that is a big deal, but you don't immediately lose. However, the game also has degrees of success or failure. So for instance, you could have destroyed 2 of the 3 bases and then died on your way to the 3rd one. And that, depending on the mission, could possibly have sent you to a 3rd different mission. Which was really interesting, because not very many games did that, and to be honest, not very many games do that today. Which is why I said that I think this sort of branching, failure state aware mission structure is something that games could still learn from. It makes it less of a binary choice of either you win, or you go back to a checkpoint until you win. There's more to it than that. There is a punishment for losing, but there's also a way to keep going with that punishment in mind to make up for it. However, if you're able to finish enough missions, eventually you'll move on to
Delta Sector,
where the sky is different, and you'll be facing tougher and tougher odds. But by then you'll probably have some medium or even heavy Hercs with much better equipment, and you'll be able to do stuff like this with my Apocalypse here, one of my favorite Hercs, and armed with some of my favorite weapons. And it gets pretty silly fun once you're able to do things like surgically detach legs with giant particle cannon blasts and things like that. It sounds a little gruesome, but it's really enjoyable. And of course, by this point, you're going to have your team along with you most of the time. You can issue orders to them, tell them to go to certain points on the map, have them cover you, have them scan for hostiles for you, all sorts of stuff like that. Because again, the full-on simulation is actually sort of available for you to take advantage of at this point, and once you get to the 2nd sector in the game, it starts to ramp up in pretty much every way, and gets a lot more difficult and a lot more hectic, but also a lot more fully featured, because by this point you'll probably have more Hercs to build, more weapons to take advantage of, and even more mission types to do. Things like patrols, base strikes, base defenses, all sorts of things. You can even do things like uploading viruses to listening posts. If you fail that mission, you'll actually have a harder time in the next mission, which is a base defense, because uploading the virus causes one of the groups of enemies that would normally have attacked you to not attack you anymore, because they are inflicted with the virus. But if you succeed in the mission, well, then that mission down the line will become easier. All these sorts of cause and effect things were very new to me as a kid, and it was hugely impressive that a game like this was actually able to do it. I should really mention the arsenal of the game by this point, by the way, is really cool. You have your normal sort of mech standbys like autocannons, various missile launchers. By the way, the missiles are pretty sweet. You've got a choice of 4 different missile types, and one of them is called electro-optical, and you actually guide it yourself with the arrow keys after you launch it, which of course makes you a bit of a sitting duck at the time that you're guiding it, but also is hilarious because you can use it as sort of a sniper missile and just like shoot them in the knees with it from like half a mile away, which is really fun. There are things like the particle beams, which is what I'm using now to detach various bits and blow off their feet. And there are also various things like the elf weapons, which have nothing to do with Santa Claus and are actually those that you see right there. They're basically mech-sized lightning guns. And there are 2 variants of those as well. One of them fires a yellow lightning beam, and the other one fires a much more powerful blue lightning beam that really drains your energy very, very quickly, but it allows you to do very silly things like, I mean, it's basically just melts whatever's in front of you. Very short range, and it sucks away nearly all of your energy, but it's really fun. And then there's the plasma cannon.
Enemy target destroyed.
The plasma cannon basically fires homing neon jellyfish that sort of get anywhere near an enemy and then completely obliterate them in just a very, very satisfying fashion. The upside is that it's so massively overpowered that almost nothing can survive a single hit from it. The downside is that it leaves very little salvage for you to, well, salvage at the end of the mission, and also that a single shot takes like as much power as New York City in about a month, and that they're kind of expensive to make. And like I said, it's very much overkill. You can even twin link them and use 2 of them at once on some Hercs if you really don't like having energy at all. But I don't see any sort of reason to ever have two of them because that's just ridiculously overpowered. But they are really fun to use. They're a strange weapon, just a homing energy weapon is kind of an odd thing. And of course, like I said, they do draw a hideous amount of power, so you can't use them too often because your shields need to recharge, and that takes power too. So if you're in combat and are taking damage, then, you know, conserve that. But, as you will see, you do sometimes encounter pit bulls on the ground rather than in your razor in later missions, and that can become very threatening very quickly. And they are actually the singular case that I can think of where a plasma cannon isn't just immediate ridiculous overkill, because they can actually take shots from it and not go down. Because they're jerks like that. And that's a case where having some plasma cannons in a mission can actually be a very, very valuable thing. As fun as they are to use, generally speaking, they just waste too much salvage and weapons to be all that valuable. Unless you just want to speed through a mission as quickly as possible. However, when it comes to facing pit bulls, being able to take out their legs more reliably by targeting them with plasma cannon shots, or just taking out that gigantic triple EMP array thing they have, is genuinely quite a useful thing, and I can see why they would be handy there. Also, that effect of the Hercs hopping on one leg for a second sometimes before collapsing into a heap after they lose one, or even if you completely blow off the top half of an enemy, sometimes they'll actually still walk around for a second as like a flaming pair of legs. That's a nice touch. One final thing to note, by the way, about the plasma cannon is you can't really tell from the effect of the hit because you can't like physically see it really, but it does have a blast radius. A rather significant one, actually, and you can take out multiple close together enemies with it, or if you're like I was as a kid, you can accidentally blow yourself up with it repeatedly by using it as a close range weapon like an idiot. Don't do that. Another thing to say about the game is its aesthetic, really, in general. It has that sort of look that really only games from this era can, that look that's sort of technological advancement on the edge, mixed with technical limitation holding it back as much as it could at the time. The sort of mid-90s look. Other games that kind of remind me of this, things like Hellbender, Descent to a certain extent, and Omega Boost even though that was a PS1 game, they all had this sort of look, this very dismal look. It's not a pleasant looking game, but that's not an insult. It's actually meant to look that way. I mean, it's deadly war machines in a post-apocalyptic Earth, and the appearance very much mirrors that. Hello, cat. You also have the idea that, I mean, even just the fog in the distance, which could be, I mean, obviously it's a limitation of draw distance, but even because of the color and the general sort of dismal look of everything, the fog itself just looks like it could rust whatever is in it. That's just how everything looks. It's just gray, brown, rusted, and kind of just not pleasant looking. Kind of like Quake, actually. And I really like that look, actually, for this era. I love the way that everything, especially the buildings, look like these sort of flat, shaded polygons until you get close to them, and then the textures, you know, LOD style kind of fade in, although because LOD wasn't really all that advanced at the time, it's very noticeable and very sharp, the way they just sort of pop in all of a sudden. I love the way that looks. Just destroying bases like this is really fun. The thunderous explosion sounds mixed with the sort of warm crackle of the fires that you cause and everything is a really nice bit of atmospheric kind of nuance to the destruction that you are causing around you. And even the little bits of sound design, like the bouncing rubble around you that everything explodes and throws outwards, actually makes sound, which is cool. And again, it's a simulation game, so you'd expect that kind of detail, and it's fun that it's there. And really, all of this kind of makes me impressed at the designers over at Dynamics at the time, that they were able to kind of meld with the limitations of the time and actually make something that benefits from the limitations. I mean, the fact that everything has to be these sort of a very limited number of polygons with a very limited sort of flat textured shading effect to it and everything actually makes things look cooler and more alien and otherworldly than they otherwise would have if they were at a much higher texture quality and were more detailed looking. I think that's a hallmark of a really proficient design team, is instead of being limited by the limitations, they embraced the limitations and used them to make their art style even more standout and different. And that's how I would describe a lot of the Cybrid Herc designs and a lot of the building designs, especially the ones that incorporate those weird blue crystal things, which I didn't see any of here, but sometimes you have to actually target the buildings just to find out what they are, because some of them just look that strange. And I really appreciate that design and that combination of embracing the limitations of the time and combining it with the prowess of the art team to create something that really could only have come from this era. And actually we're seeing a bit of a resurgence of that now with some newer indie games trying to kind of ape that style, which is interesting, and I'd like to see if they're able to successfully do that. So yeah, that's Earthsiege 2. It's really something quite special, and it's very finicky sometimes to get working on modern systems, especially if you have Windows 10. I'm in fact actually using a glide wrapper, which is why you see that watermark in the bottom right, and I do apologize for the black bars, but that was the only choice I had when filming this, because if I did it in any other way, the sort of full screen-ish view that you may have seen in the very beginning of the video, that actually caused lots of crashing, and it cuts off the edges of the screen in a pretty severe way for the recording, and honestly the game deserves better than that, and I wanted to show it off in its full glory if I could, and that really the only way to do that was to have these black bars and stuff, otherwise the screen was cut off and weird looking. And if you're wondering, the game is actually available for free. Hi-Rez, the company, actually released the game as freeware at Tribes Universe, and the reason for that, if you don't know, is because Earthsiege and Earthsiege 2, as well as the rest of the series, like the Metaltech games, well, game I suppose, besides Earthsiege really there's only one other one. Eventually, there was never actually an Earthsiege 3, but there was a Starsiege after that, which of course became Starsiege Tribes, which became Tribes. Earthsiege actually became the Tribes games, which are still going today, technically. It may be hard to see that, seeing that these are mech simulation games in the vein of things like MechWarrior and stuff, and Tribes are mostly about infantry combat, skiing, and blue plate specials, but they are in fact the same universe and were made by the same people originally. So yeah, Earthsiege and Tribes are the same universe, and that's what they became. So if you're a fan of Tribes, which, I mean, they are awesome, then maybe you should try and go back and see where it all started, because Earthsiege is really something pretty special, and you don't see a lot of mech games coming out today, unfortunately. We need more of them. Although you can't really ever have too many, you can always have more. And we definitely don't have enough. So that's my take on Earthsiege 2, a game from my childhood, a game that I will always remember, and a game that is always worth going back to play if you can ever get the thing to work, because it is becoming increasingly difficult to do so, although to be fair, it is like 21 years old now. So, you know, the expected problems are there. But hey. So yeah, if you want to give it a shot, I suggest that you do so. Just, there's no real, risk to trying since it's available for free, so that even if you can't get it to work, at least you didn't spend anything. And if you do try it, I suggest going to the Sierra help pages and getting the updated installer from there, because the freeware version of Tribes is actually an ISO, a disk image. And you'll need an installer, and the installer is updated to help to get it to work better on modern systems, so it does some of the work for you, although depending on, your system and all that, blah blah blah, variables, your mileage may vary. So give it a shot. What have you got to lose? Earthsiege 2, everyone. A game that really shouldn't be forgotten. Thank you very much for watching. If you enjoyed this video, please do feel free to share it around. Hit the like button, I guess. Hit the dislike button, I don't really care. And I'll see you next time.